Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 99, special Yud Shvat edition. I want to begin dedicating this class to the Ili Nishmas, Hagdesha Daphne Meir, that was tragically killed by yet another terrorist in Israel. Hashem Yinkom Doma, and may the words we share together and any inspiration and actions that we add, both in learning Torah, in adding in tzedakah, fulfillment of mitzvahs, in every possible way, help eradicate this cancer that is now spreading in a constant daily basis. Lesakum pamayim tzara, we should never hear from any other negative or bad things. We should only hear shlichus in a revealed way. May her and her family be consoled among all the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, and we should only hear shlichus going forward. Being that it's Yud Shvat this week, and Yud Shvat is the 66th anniversary of the Yortzeit of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Histalkus, as we emphasize Histalik Yikara Dekut Shebricha B'Kula Alman, as underscored right in the beginning of the Hemshech HaMaimer Basa Legani, which we'll discuss in a moment, and also the 66th anniversary of the Rebbe immediately assuming leadership, formally a year later when the Rebbe said Basa Legani in Tovshin Yud Aleph. So clearly, when you're talking about Chassidus Applied, MyLife, Chassidus Applied, most appropriate is to address this because I don't believe I would be sitting here, and many of us would not be doing and fulfilling the missions of our lives had Yud Shvat not taken place. So Yud Shvat, in a sense, you can say, is the establishment of the generation called the seventh generation, the Deir Hashvi, as hinted to, even more than hinted to, right in the beginning of the Maimer Basa Legani, and as the Rebbe took the mantle and made it clear that we are now in the seventh generation from the Alter Rebbe, and just like the seventh generation from Avram Avinu, from Abraham, was Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, who brought the Shekhinah down to earth. After the preceding generations, each one brought it down one level closer. We too are the seventh generation from the time of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chassidus Chabad, that will bring down the Shekhinah to earth, the Gula Amitis Vashlema, where there'll be Ika Shekhinah B'Tachtenim Hoysa, in the beginning of creation, at the end, when the Begili Elikuz Be'elam Hazah Gashmi, as the Alter Rebbe makes it clear, that's how he defines the times of Mashiach. In the words of the Rambam, a time when the world will be filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea, citing Yeshaya, the prophet Isaiah, and the words in the literal words of the Rambam, that the world that the entire business of the world, of all people on earth, 7 billion of us, will be not materialism as an end in itself, but as a means to know God. Knowing God is learning Chassidus, is understanding godly wisdom, not just the mechanical part of it, we'll call the body of Torah, but also the inner dimension of Torah. So, the seventh generation of Chassidus, the seventh generation, which began on this day, Yud Shvat, 66 years ago, this week, is in a sense the beginning of a new era, a new stage that would conclude the process. And obviously, until the process is completely concluded, we have not finished the job. So, I want to use this opportunity to wake myself up and wake everybody that I can reach. We have to shake ourselves up because when, as they say, when the results are not there, you have to do something different. It's a sign of insanity for someone to believe that you're going to do the same thing and expect different results. We have to do something different. When I say different, I don't mean different outside of the scope of what the Rabbeim and the Rebbe gave us, the mandate they gave us to do, but to do it on a level that is outside of our comfort zone, a level that will, a revolutionary level, using the words of Tanya, chapter 15, when he says that Aveda means doing something more than your comfort zone, even when you're doing the best things. The time of the Talmud, they would study 100 times, they would review the same Pedic, they would review their same lesson in learning. And yet, that's called lo yavodeh, as if they didn't serve, because that was the custom, that was the routine, that was the comfort zone. That's the me'ev pomim va'achas, as he says, that achas, that 101st time, because it was not routine, that qualitatively outweighs the other 100 times, and that's what creates shifts and changes. The same thing with ourselves. Even if one feels that they've done everything perfectly, but as long as it's your comfort zone, as long as it's your routine, your pattern, then it's not considered Avodah. So as we're coming to this 66th anniversary of Yud Shvat, what better time to reconnect to the mission statement of our generation. As the Rebbe made it very clear, the Deir HaShvi, not due to what we've earned or due to our Veda, simply the Betulda. If you count the generations, this is the 7th generation. Why were you and I born in this generation? Not 100 years ago, not 200 years ago, not 50 years ago. The reason for 50 years would include this generation. But why not earlier or later? Because this is our shlichus. And the Rebbe, the Nasi Hadar, made it very clear what the mission is, that everything we do should be infused with that element of preparing ourselves, preparing our families and our communities and the world to receiving that Gili Elikus, that whoever you speak to, whoever you meet, wherever you go, you are a shining example of what God wants a human being to be like, what God wants a Jew to be like. And by doing so, by dugma chai, by being a living example, and by inspiring through example, and through words that come from the heart, that's how we achieve this goal. So of course, with the 3 pillars upon which the Torah stands, the Torah Judaism, the world stands, I should say, Torah, Vedic, Gemilas, Chasadim, those are the 3 pillars, those are the 3 mechanisms, the 3 tools we use, the 3 methodologies. Torah is studying, cognitive conditioning. Aveda is Aveda Shabalev, Huzuit Tefillah, that's emotional conditioning. And Gemilas Chasadim is behavioral conditioning. When a person aligns their mind, the cognitive, and their hearts and emotions, the emotional, and their actions and behavior toward this objective and this mission, that's how we change the world. And that's what Chassidus is all about, is taking an understanding from Chabad, bringing it into Chagas. Chabad is Chochmah Binah Das, bringing it to Chagas, bringing it into Nehi, which is Chesed Gvura Tefreza, bringing it to action, Netzach Ched Yesed, and ultimately into Malchus. And you have the full spectrum of 10, which of course corresponds to the number 10 of Yud Shvat. And if you think about it, everything connected to Yud Shvat is connected with the number 10 and with the letter Yud. You have the 10th of Shvat. It was in the year 5710, Tovshin Yud. The Frierdiker Rebbe's both names both begin with the Yud, and we also know in the last year of Chaim Chayuse Ba'al Medain, in his life on this earth, he began to actually change that second Yud and make it larger and larger. Became a Ksav Ashuri, a Yud that's, we usually write a Yud, we write like a little dot or a little line. And actually you could see it progressing through the entire year, beginning approximately Yud Shvat, a little before Yud Shvat, Tovshin Tes. Through the year, the Yud became bigger to the point that the last letter that we have, which is 2 days before Yud Shvat, Tovshin Yud, it's a really full-bodied Yud, where actually you could see filled in the box, like a Yud with a Ketzish Yud and a which means the dot on top of the Yud and the part that draws downward. The Rebbe in one of his letters writes that someone asked the Rebbe, he says, the reason for it I've not heard, but in one of the Fabrengens of Yud Shvat in the early years, the Rebbe said and explained the Yud, which of course we know that the Yud is expression from the Alter Rebbe, and the Rebbe said it with a niggin, that Yud represents the Apintele von Eben, Apintele von Unten, actually it says that about a Vav. But the Pintele von Eben, Pintele von Unten is the Yud, von Eben is the Eberste, the Yud Lamata is the Rid, and the Vav that connects it. Yud is spelled Yud Vav Daled. But the Yud reflects the spark, reflects the divine spark within each of us, and our ability to connect to that component. In addition, this year's chapter in Basar Legani, let me just mention something about Basar Legani before I get to the chapter. Basar Legani is the mimer, the last mimer that was released to study that Shabbos Pasha Boy, Yud Shvat, Tovshin Yud. As we know, in the later years, the Frierdiker Rebbe stopped saying Maimorim in the last few years due to health reasons, but every week or every period would come out a mimer, usually from earlier years, that the Rebbe himself would publish. It was signed by him, signed as Pesach Dover, signed an introduction, signed by the Rebbe. So for that Shabbos, Pasha Boy came out a kuntras that had 2 Maimorim in it. One Maimer was for Yud Shvat, which was also the yortzeit of the Rebbetzin Rivka, the Rebbe Marash's Rebbetzin. And the second Maimer was the Maimer for Yud Shvat HaYesheves Beganim, in honor of the Rebbetzin Stern Sar, the Frierdiker Rebbe's mother, was Yud Shvat her yahrzeit. So this was the Kuntras. Each Maimer had 5 chapters. Now this Maimer is actually from Tafresh Pei Gimel, originally said and delivered by the Frierdiker Rebbe in 1923. It's a different name, Parsha Boy Maimer Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh. The Rebbe took that Maimer, clearly by direction of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and that's what came out. Now no one, of course, knew what was coming this Shabbos. That Friday night, as they were learning the Maimer, Bochrim and the people in the Anash that were learning the Balabat, that were learning the Maimer, they noticed that in the Pesach Dover, in the Chagdom, in the introduction, the word Shlita, which said Kvei Dushas Admur Shlita, which was referring to the Frierdiker Rebbe, Shlita has in its acronym, it was missing the Yud. It said Shin Les Lamed Tes Aleph without the Yud. It was just noticed by some people. Then, of course, the next morning, it became tragically understood how this would change history. That morning, 7:45, 8 o'clock, around 8:10, the Frierdiker Rebbe was not feeling well, and Stalkus HaNeshama was approximately a little after 8 that morning, Shabbos Parsha Bo, Yud Shvat. Being it was Shabbos, obviously could not demonstrate open grieving and Avelis. So the Rebbe just told people that people shouldn't come in unless they go to the mikveh. And that was already a sign people understood something had happened. The next day, Sunday, was the Levaya, which today we can see on video. Very sad to watch it, even till this day. But at the same time, as the sun sets, the sun also rises, as we say, V'zarach HaShemesh or Ba HaShemesh, and you have the rise of the Rebbe as the Deir HaShvi. Of course, there was the pain involved, and all that took place. Over the year, all the demands and beseeching of the Rebbe, and finally, the year later, Yud Shvat, Tavshin Yud Aleph, is when the Rebbe, at the behest of one of the Chassidim, in the middle of the Fabrengen, the Rebbe was speaking shlichus. It was honoring the first yahrzeit of Frierdiker Rebbe, and Rabbi Nemtsov got up and said, Rebbe, genug shlichus mevil her na maimer Chassidus. And the whole crowd, it wasn't a large crowd, it was upstairs in 770, I heard that the room was relatively not full. And yet there was this historic moment, everyone was anticipating, what is the Rebbe going to do here? And just a little while after that, the Rebbe began the Maimer Bos Selegani Achesi Kala, which today we have, thank God, not just in writing and edited, and mugad by the Rebbe, but also a recording of it. The whole Maimer from beginning to end, the Rebbe made stops throughout the Maimer where they sang the Nigunim of the previous Rabbeim. And the Rebbe, that became a custom in general, where the Rebbe in every Bos Selegani, every year after that, would mention all the Rabbeim, essentially of invoking the shlichus of us, and the Maimorim would be built on the Bos Selegani, but integrating into it explanations from all the Rabbeim, including the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid, and later years from the Rebbe's father, and so on. Now that was the year Tavshin Yud Aleph. The Maimer, the next kuntras that came out was for Purim, which included another 2 Maimorim, Purim and Beis Nisan. Another 5 chapters, so the third Maimer and a 4th Maimer. And that was the conclusion of this Hemshech Bos Selegani, so a total of 4 Maimorim and 5 chapters each, for a total of 20 chapters. The next year, Tavshin Yud Beis, no one knew that this would happen. The Rebbe said that this year, since it's the second year, we will now discuss the chapter 2 of the Hemshech Bos Selegani. And then in Tavshin Yud Gimel, chapter 3. And every year after that, the focus was the chapter that corresponded to that year. Of course, Tavshin Lamed came, 1970, which was the 20th chapter. Everyone was wondering what would happen next year. Tavshin Lamed Aleph. Tavshin Lamed Aleph, the Rebbe began the cycle a second time. In a different type of explanation, different type of Amorim, but still focusing. Lamed Aleph was chapter 1, Lamed Beis chapter 2. And this went on for almost a complete another cycle till Tavshin Memches, 1988, when it was the last time the Rebbe said, Maimorim, in an orally way, was basically Parsha Chukas Tavshin Memches. It's another discussion. So that would be the last time. Tavshin Memtes, there was no Bos Selegani, at least ones that we could hear. So the Rebbe went the cycle of 20, then another cycle of 18 chapters. But Chassidim continued, of course, to learn each year the corresponding chapter. Now we are now in the 4th cycle, and studying chapter 6. In other words, the 4th time. So we have, thank God, the chapter 6, of course, of the original, and we also have the Maimon the Rebbe said in Tavshin Tez Zayin, which would be corresponding to that chapter 6, and the Maimorim the Rebbe said in Tavshin Lamed Vav, since it was, the Rebbe said then 2 Maimorim Bos Selegani, all focusing on chapter 6. Here is not a place to go through a whole, it requires a share of its own to go through the entire Maimer. But I'll just talk about one key point, the point of bittul. The Rebbe, this Maimer talks about this, the chapter rather, he talks about the kroshim, why they're called kroshim, keresh. Keresh are the beams that were in the Mishkan, which of course is the theme of the Hamshach is what? Is building a Mishkan on earth for God. In the first discourse, he talks about it in the first 5 chapters, and here he starts talking about the letters Keresh. And the bottom line he talks about is the letter Reish and Daled. Reish and Daled are the Zelu Umazeh. They both look similarly. They're 2 lines. And they also mean the same thing. Reish, the Daled comes from the word Dal or Dalus, which is poverty, impoverished. And Reish comes from the word Rosh, which also means impoverished. However, they're very 2 different impoverishments. One it comes from a healthy and strong place, and one comes from a bad and negative place. In simple English, you can have an element of being impoverished and empty in the context of low self-esteem and all that comes with negative energy, and you could have an impoverishment which comes from a bittul, that comes from strength. Similar to what says in other places, there's a difference between an onov and a shafel. A shafel is someone who just feels low self-esteem. They feel worthless. They're like a shmata, like a doormat, a skupa nidresses. You have an onov. An onov is very, very aware of their strengths. Moshe Rabbeinu was called onov, the greatest onov. Very aware of his strengths. Yet you say, these strengths are not my own. The bittul knowing that it comes from a greater place, and if someone else had these same strengths, they may have done better than I. So he explains the difference between this bittul and that bittul. The bittul of the Kedusha, so I want to focus on one point. It's a beautiful line, which frankly also drew my attention because connected to, on a personal note, things that I did in my earlier part of my career, where he speaks about the bittul of a student to a teacher. And that dafke, gas ruach is not a keli, is not a container to receive, because of, someone that's filled with themselves has no room to allow anything else into them. So the Frierdiker Rebbe continues in this chapter and says, a person who's a gas ruach, someone's filled, is not able to receive some Torah. If someone is studying and he's not bottled betachlis, which means he's a mitzias be'ene atzmei, he sees himself as an entity of his own, in his own eyes, he sees himself as important, he cannot be a recipient. And then he adds in the parentheses, like a student, that during the time that his teacher is transmitting and teaching him, he's thinking and concentrating on on understanding the idea that's being taught. Now you think that's great. Instead of being distracted and doing other things, he's focusing on what he's being taught. No. And in truth, what he has to be doing at that moment is only to receive the words of the Rav. And only afterwards to focus on understanding the idea. And he goes on to speak more about this bittul. Why am I focusing on this? It's what you can focus on, because I think there's a tremendous lesson here for each of our lives, talking about Chassidus Applied from this week's chapter. The Rebbe, of course, explains this chapter in full glory in the 3 Maimarim, the Tavshin Tazayin Maimer and the 2 Maimarim of Tavshin Lamed Vav. That what do you know from this? This is one of the points I often share when people ask me how we are able, as a chayzer, which was someone who remembered the Rebbe's Farbrengens, how are we able to remember hours and hours of Farbrengens? The Rebbe would speak, just to give you the scope of it, the Rebbe's pace of speaking, when it was recorded, we knew, was for every hour the Rebbe spoke, it would, typed up and transcribed, would be 20 pages on an 8.5 by 11 pages, double-spaced, which would mean a 4-hour Farbrengen, which should yield 80 pages. That's what we had to remember. How does one remember that? The secret is this parenthesis, that when you're listening, you're busy absorbing and not trying to understand. Now, adult minds are like wet sponges, saturated sponges, and children's minds are like dry sponges. A dry sponge doesn't have any preconceived notions, doesn't have a framework, doesn't have perspective. That's why it's so easy to teach children a new language, Aleph Beis. An adult mind would not have patience to study a new letter, sitting around and learning about Aleph, Kametz Aleph O, Kametz Beis Ba, and so on. An adult mind fits ideas into pre-existing frameworks. We already have saturated sponges, essentially. That's why children remember so well. And for us, it's very difficult. Listening to a Rav, listening to the Rebbe speak, it was necessary to put away the comprehension, the processing of the idea, and just focus on absorbing. Basically, it's the art of listening. And it's not only a tremendous lesson in remembering and absorbing ideas, but it's also a tremendous lesson in communication, in dealing with friends, dealing with spouses, dealing with children. Do you really know how to listen? Many people think they're good listeners. Ask people that you speak to and ask them if that speak to you, and ask them if they think you're a good listener. A good listener requires emptying the keli, klei reikon, as he says, emptying your container and absorbing another idea. And if you don't do that, the idea will somewhat become diluted and polluted even, filtered by your own perspective. So this is a tremendous lesson in many, many areas. Just jumped out at me as I was reading the chapter this year. And one lesson that we can all apply when we study something, having that type of bittul, just reading the page. What is the Rebbe saying? What is this page trying to say to me? Before you interpret, before you process, before you cross-reference, before you try to answer kinds of questions. And it wasn't easy, because when the Rebbe would speak, the temptation is to understand. The temptation is, oh wow, this answers a question I had yesterday, this explains this, the contradiction, and you fit it into your intelligent framework, which sounds great, but it's not good for memory. It's not good for absorption. And here he says even further, that's not the way a person really listens. Listening means you absorb. First hear what's said, and then comes stage 2, where you sit down and concentrate and understand what does it mean, how does it fit in to your previous understandings, and so on. Much more can be said about this, but that I think is one tremendous lesson from this week, corresponding to this year's chapter 6, Yud Shvat. And to go back again to the central point is, this is the mission statement of the Rebbe, in effect the mission statement of our entire generation. We are the 7th generation, the generation, as the Rebbe says, that will bring the Shekhinah down Lamata. So this is a day when we have to renew our commitment to that in the fullest possible way, and look at what can we do that has not yet been done in this regard. I just want to point out one more thing, that so a note from the Rebbe, just to show the aggravation he had for those that didn't remember Yud Shvat. So the Rebbe writes in one settle here, Haflo Pella, underlined twice, which means wonder of wonders. To all those, it was clearly referring to something they were publishing at the time. For all those that saw this material that was being published, or those responsible for seeing it, both here and in Israel, not one person, Ola al Deite, rose in his mind that maybe it's worthwhile mentioning in this material something about Yud Shvat. 2 exclamation points. Hayesh shir leheder asimus lev. Is there a limit to not caring? The Rebbe asks. And there's a similar sentiment expressed in Fabringen Parsha Boy, Tavshem Mem Gimel, that also similar. Maybe this was written, it looks from the handwriting, it looks similar to that time, so maybe this handwritten note corresponds to what the Rebbe spoke about, Boy Tavshem Mem Gimel, again, that nobody thought of printing anything in connection with Yud Shvat. Is there a limit? And the answer, of course, is that if this was said then how does this apply to us today? We have to take this to heart, that we have to simas lev, to care. And care means you do something about it. You do something about it in your personal life, in others that you know, obviously b'dar keneyam, in a pleasant way, and to wake ourselves up, to shake ourselves up, to shake up others. And one more thing I'd mention, Tavshem Mem Zayin, right after the court case of Hey Tevis, that was one on Hey Tevis, that Yud Beis Tevis, every day the Rebbe spoke, Yud Beis Tevis was the end of 7 days from Hey Tevis. Right after Asar B'Tevis, the Rebbe came out with a campaign, so to speak, that now 30 days before Yud Shvat, everybody should add in Limud HaTorah and Sinas HaTzedakah, but the Rebbe added something unique, which clearly can also apply now. And that is that you should go to our Rav and Mashpia, to make it more real, the Rebbe said, go to your Rav and Mashpia and report to them, and there should be 3 b'chinas, 3 tests. They should test you on what you've actually done, increasing in Torah and in Tzedakah. And the Rebbe said the first test should be Chav Shvat, Yud Chav Shvat. I'm sorry, my mistake. Yud Tevis to Chav Tevis, 20th Tevis, which is of course the Yahrzeit of the Rambam. The second should be on Rosh Chodesh Shvat, 10 days later. And the third should be Yud Shvat. And the Rebbe went further, and he says he wants the Mashpiyim and the Ravs to write into the Rebbe and report to the Rebbe who was tested by them. The Rebbe goes on to say, and if I don't get a report, I will assume that it wasn't done by those individuals. So we have a clear directive that clearly applies today to add in our own way. And of course, there's all the other Hairas and directives of how we should celebrate Yud Shvat. Okay. One more thing I should say. We're about to announce in the coming days the second annual MyLife Chassidus Applied contest, which was a huge success last year. I mentioned it, I wanted to mention, even though we're not officially announcing it, but the contest will be similar with obviously we're tweaking it to improve it, but you could already begin thinking and writing your essays. We'll have some similar conditions. So, but stay tuned. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because last year we discovered in the middle of, after the announcement, the letter from the Rebbe connecting it to Yud Shvat. Now last year, literally 50 years from the day we announced it, almost to the day that we announced it, we discovered a letter from the Rebbe on Tezvav Tevis, on I think it was Tezvav Tevis, Tovshin Tezvav, which was 50 years from yesterday. And 50 years, Tezvav, 50 years or 60 years, am I mistaken? Yeah, 60 years. My mistake. 60 years to the day. And the Rebbe writes, and translating it, in connection with the 10th of Shvat coming upon us, it should be suggested to the girls, he was writing about a girls' school, at least the older ones among them, that each one should write an essay about some topic related to the work, the Aveda of my father-in-law, the Rebbe, his talks, etc., etc. In that same letter, the Rebbe writes, we see from experience here and other places that when you draw in the students so that they get involved in the work by making their own presentations, this evokes far greater enthusiasm and interest among their friends. It's a letter printed in Igris Kedesh, volume 10, it's at Tovshin Tezvav, and pages 238 and 239. So I wanted to mention that in honor of Yud Shvat as well. So the contest will be announced shortly. And I hope that you begin to think about it and participate, and Hashem should bless that everyone out there should write excellent essays. And as I mentioned many times, everybody's a winner in this context, but we'll also have, of course, the incentives that we've had. And stay tuned for more information on this. With that, let me go into some follow-up notes and letters. We've been receiving a lot more than usual in the last weeks. It's been only accelerating. It's growing, thank God, more than I've ever expected that this would still be going on after 99 weeks. And more importantly, to keep receiving questions and comments and critique, positive and negative and everything possible. And I promise, binah, that I will read those comments. I can't read them all every week, so if you don't hear your note or your question or your comments being addressed, stay tuned, that will be addressed. Rest assured that will be addressed in some of in the coming weeks. So I'll begin with one that someone writes. Thank you, Rabbi Jacobson, for your weekly inspiration. I don't miss a lesson, and I appreciate each one. You spoke last week about the relevance of all of Torah. That was the theme of Karev Elecha Dover Me'ed, and said that you got an okay from the Rebbe to interpret the Alter Rebbe's intention on Karev Elecha Dover Me'ed to mean relevant. Yes. This past week, I saw a sikha from Parsha Vayera, Tovshin Lamed Aleph, Va'era, I should say, Va'era Tovshin Lamed Aleph, and on the first page, the Rebbe says just that. He quotes the Sharblat of Tanya and explains it just that way. I wanted to bring it to your attention. I assume, based on your comment, that it was even before you asked the Rebbe about it. All the best. Thank you very much for that. Mashpia, follow-up. Thank you for your weekly inspiration and enlightenment, which is greatly appreciated, especially when done in such an altruistic fashion as a true community service with no monetary compensation. I would like to comment about the topic of Mashpiyim and ask if you feel it's appropriate, please mention it online. I've watched a video of the Rebbe where he speaks about the criteria for a Mashpiyah. You would know exactly which sikha and where it could be found. The criteria is Rachmanim, Baishanim, Geim Lechasadim, the three signs that the Jewish people are blessed with. Rachmanim are compassionate, Baishanim are bashful, have a sense of, tznius and shame in a positive way, not arrogant and aggressive, and Geim Lechasadim, kind. Yes, the Rebbe did say that. I believe it was in Tov Shem Mem Beis, when the Rebbe spoke about those three signs, but he mentioned also, I believe, in Tov Shem Mem Vav and Mem Zayin. I don't remember which Rabbeinu exactly. If someone listening knows, please pass that on to me, and I'll announce it. If not, I'll look around myself. Quality is sometimes hard to find, the writer continues, but a very good telling sign of this might be an adequate mashpia. For anyone who would like to watch it, please Google this topic, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, on how to choose a mentor. I also want to mention that in context of the Mashpiyim, the Rebbe then published a special edition of the Kuntras Avos Yisrael. In Tov Shin Lamed Zayin, when the Rebbe came out with Miftzah Avos Yisrael, the Rebbe himself prepared a Kuntras Avos Yisrael, a short Kuntras, a short booklet that gathered from everything, from the Pasuk and the Torah, from Torah Shabbat Peh, from the Rambam, Halacha, and all the way to Kabbalah and Chassidus, everything about Avos Yisrael. Not everything that exists, but a very concise and very, very powerful book. Then he published a special edition, this one this writer is referring to, for Mashpiyim. And he was going to give a signed copy to anyone who assumes to be a Mashpiyah. I remember it was published a special gold cover that was different than the regular one. And unfortunately, it's one of the things that were not fully, let's put it this way, fully fulfilled. So if we talk about strings being tied, and a chayv, a responsibility, and a debt that we owe the Rebbe, this is one of them. That's why I mentioned it so often. And the Rebbe did not stop. Later came the words Aseh L'charav, Shabbos Chazayin Tef Shem Vav, Shabbos Devarim, and that concept of Mashpiyim, and what do we need more than today? And the Rebbe connected it to the Hagdama introduction to Tanya, that all the answers are there, and if you can't find an answer, you should find the Gedalim Shebe'ir. I translate as being the emotionally mature person in your community to help you find those answers. We need that. We need Chassidus Applied. We need it to be done in a way that helps us deal with our issues. So, and the Rebbe, the fact that he published a special book of Avos Yisrael for Mashpiyim, interestingly, obviously you can say every time you're a Mashpiyah, you're performing Avos Yisrael, so it's an act of kindness, but you can also say the Rebbe wanted Mashpiyim to learn about Avos Yisrael because it's a critical component on how to be a mashpiyah. It's not about, the Rebbe said then in the Yutas Kislev, Lamed Zayin Sicha, he says it's not about Gedula Nasati Lechem, Shrara Nasati. I'm not giving you greatness, I'm not giving you leadership, I'm giving you service, responsibility, the statement made on Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's not about the mashpiyah becoming a leader and authority and barking orders at others. On the contrary, it's about serving others and being kind to them and helping them find what they need to find in an objective fashion. So thank you for that feedback. There's been more feedback, but as I said, I'll try to spread it out through the different weeks. Much more feedback, and I want to go to some new questions, and also follow up on a few other items, as we've done in the past. So, question. A few weeks ago, I spoke about Bochrim. Questions that a group of Bochrim and students in yeshiva. Now I want to go and give equal time to the other gender, which is the women. So here's a collection of a few questions that we've received in that regard. Single women. What is the shlichus of a single woman? The Rebbe speaks much about the special role and responsibility of women in our generation, which is especially underscored this week when we read in the Shabbos Shira Haftarah, coming this Shabbos, Shira's Dveira, the song of the woman. Even though Oz Yasher Meisha B'nai Yisrael seems to be the primary song, and only Vatosha Dv Miriam's song, the woman's song, comes secondary, but the Haftarah is focused completely Shira's Dveira. And there's actually an entire sikha from the Frierdiker Rebbe and Likutei Diburim about this, addressing it from the Alter Rebbe's point of view with a long story from the Baal Shem Tov, how everything is dependent on the woman. And the Rebbe brings it, especially in the later year sikhas in the Nuns, Nun Aleph, where he talks about, and Nun Beis as well, where he talks about that focus. So clearly this is appropriate, and of course Yud Shvat is, in the sikhas of Yud Shvat, you also see the emphasis not just for the men, but for the women's specific role in the shlichus of our generation of the Deir HaShvi. Okay, so that's, but what specifically is the mission of single women following school and pre-marriage? Besides dating, which does not occupy full time, what should the shlichus of a young woman be? Is it only about waiting around to get married? More specifically, Another questioner writes, Rabbi Jacobson, thank you for your time and energy that you give to the Lubavitch community with these weekly videos. I'd like to ask you, what is the avodah of single girls? Once girls get married, their main job is the akeres habayis. This means the foundation of the house. But as single women, what is the avodah that we should be trying to attain? I happen to love learning, so I do learn. I often get made fun of by friends and family that I'm turning into a bacher, a yeshiva student. So what would you say the Rebbe's take would be about the free time with single women, and what should they focus on? Another questioner writes, similar vein, hi Rabbi Jacobson. First, I only recently started listening to your weekly Chassidus Applied podcasts, and it filled me with a sense of calm and peace from the first one I've listened to. You clearly practice what you preach. I appreciate that you value each question and take the time to answer it, rather than make the questioner feel uncomfortable for asking. My concern right now is this, that as an older single in Shidduchim, I feel like my life is perpetually on hold while waiting to get married, and I don't know how to break out of that feeling. I started dating shortly after seminary and am now considered older. I went to college, got a degree, have been working full-time while in school, but now I feel aimless, no real idea what to do with my life, while all the while feeling like at any minute now, the right guy will walk through the door so I can settle down or commit to anything long-term. So I can't settle down or commit to anything long-term because the right guy might walk in, because who knows what will happen. I hate that no one really prepared me for life after seminary and the possibility that we would not all be married by age 20. What can you suggest for how to get through this difficult time while still believing that I may actually get married someday? Okay. Obviously, this is a big question that has been posed in many different forums and very relevant for boys as well. But since this question is coming from the other gender, the women, I'll address it from that perspective and do my best in how the Rebbe would, of course, answer this question. I've looked around. I haven't found direct answer to this immediate question, even though you can get a pretty clear direction from other letters from the Rebbe and Rebbe's answers. Firstly, we all know that the Rebbe's approach to any question, any challenge, is positivity. There's no room for demoralization, no room for sadness, and there's no room for being morose or in any way despondent. That means that even when there's a situation where it may be challenging, it means there must be a way to find a positive look at it and to fill your life with positivity, which in itself is necessary to be in the right state of mind and the right disposition to be a keli, and a container for the bracha of finding a shidduch. Who wants to meet somebody and go on a date and find the person to be saddened or depressed, even if you hide it? So there's no question that that every challenge has an ability to rise to the occasion. And it's critical that we know this. It's critical to know that hashgacha pratis, whatever reason it is, you finish school, you're not married yet, it's not just hanging around and waiting and letting others make you feel like what's the matter with you. And parents need to know this, friends need to know this, community need to know this, because it doesn't help in just making a person feel miserable. Now we understand there's a pressure, there's a cultural pressure that just comes with age, and that's part of reality, but we don't have to necessarily make it worse than what everyone knows when they come a certain point. They don't have to be reminded all the time. So I think this is not just a message for each individual, but also the environment. We have to learn to have more compassion and more empathy. We do not understand God's mysterious ways. If you have a good friend or a family member that you feel is doing something wrong, so find a kind way to share it with them. But just to be critical, and what's the matter with you? Why aren't you married already? Does not help the whole situation. Again, that doesn't solve it if we're going to be kind, but kindness at least creates an environment where you don't feel additional pressure and additional feeling something's wrong with me type of thing. Now, as far as what actually to do, look, God sent your neshama down to earth. I say I mean anyone listening to this, every individual. He sent your neshama down to earth. From the moment you're born, you have a shlichus. Now, of course, when we're newborns in a crib, we don't have the free will and volition to do anything we like. But we also have a shlichus then. Maybe the shlichus is to bring love and joy to your parents and to your family. Maybe the shlichus is to show us all what innocence is like. But every moment of a person's life, there's a positive shlichus. As we grow older, the shlichus changes form based on the age. Now, school is school. Let's go now post. To suddenly say a person finishes seminary or schooling and is not yet married, to say their shlichus ended is ridiculous. It's hepech everything. Everything we've learned. You're still on a mission. You're on a mission 24/7. And even if you're dating and dating is going well, looks like you're going to get somewhere, you still have a shlichus even on that day. It's not only about dating, as important as that is. So we have to get into a mindset to know that you are the Rebbe's soldier. You're the Rebbe's child. You're the shlich of the Eibishter on this earth to accomplish something. And that comes down to embracing your mission in the fullest sense of the word, which means discover what your talents are like, what you're good at, and figure out a way to help people. Figure a way to illuminate. Marriage is not a condition to being a shliach or a shlucha of the Rebbe in helping people. I understand the cultural pressures and we understand the importance of marriage. It's not dismissing that. It's suggesting that it's not about waiting around for something else. I mentioned a number of times that in Kedusha the Rebbe brings from both in the Halacha and in Chassidus, that in Kedusha there's no such thing as something as a step towards something else. The Bachrim were once singing a song before the Maimer that the Rebbe Rashab was about to deliver. And the Rebbe Rashab says that they were singing quickly because they wanted to hear the Maimer. And the Rebbe Rashab stopped, and instead of saying a Maimer, he spoke a whole sikha, how about a pnimi, an internal person, where he is, he's there completely. When you're singing the song, you have to sing the song completely. It's only a preparation for the Maimer. That's next step. When the Jews traveled to the Midbar, even if they stayed in one place very short while, they set up the Mishkan, they served in it, even if they packed it up the next day. Because in Kedusha, al pi Hashem yachna, al pi Hashem yisu, command the kaviyah luhudami. If it's God's word, this is where you are even for a moment, you have a mission there. And that's an attitude that we have to both inculcate within ourselves and within others. So if you have that attitude, find yourself something to do that is going to fulfill your shlichus in some way or another, while simultaneously you're available, obviously, for dating. To do that in a way that you say, I'm so busy with my shlichus and I have no time for marriage, that obviously is not the point. That's also not correct. So it's a matter of just having that type of focus, and we, meaning the rest of the community, has to support that, has to embrace it. Not in a way that replaces and not giving people an out from the commitment and the work that's necessary in finding the right soulmate, but to be able to have that positive attitude and positive approach to everything you do. So yes, if you like to learn, it should be learning. It should be some learning. It should be some way of meeting people, maybe participating, volunteering, or even getting a job with a shliach or a shlucha. There are many, many ways. Sadly, we live in a world where 80-90% of the Jews don't tineka shenishbu. Maybe everybody is, but some are in the case they don't know anything about Yiddishkeit. So it's not like there's a lack of work to be done. It can be done online. It can be done in person, many different ways. Talk to your mashpia. Find a way to fill your life. And when you wake up in the morning, you're not miserable, another day that I'm single, but you jump out of bed because you have a shlichus to accomplish. And the Rebbe is waiting for you to report back, what did you do? While at the same time, searching, being aggressive as possible and finding the correct soulmate. Now, the challenge, of course, as I said, is the people around us, and there's a culture and there's a certain negativity that people associate, and we have to be, therefore, either don't mind that or find friends and support that will support this attitude and approach. Okay. Especially considering, I should add, what I mentioned before, that there's a special shlichus that women have today. The Rebbe speaks about their personality and gentleness and their inwardness. Kfuda bas melech prima have a way to reach people that men do not have. It has a special power in bringing the Geula and Mashiach, has a special power in having more faith and being more or less egoistic. So there's qualities that women have. It's not just an equal. Women have actually qualities that men do not have. And not to use that would be not using your shlichus to the fullest. And every shlichus has to be filled, and then Hashem will definitely bless. You do the right thing that will help speed up the time that you find your soulmate, and you're in a mood, you're in a state of productivity and proactivity, and thus that itself creates proactivity, breeds proactivity, also the proactivity that will lead to the proper shidduch. Okay, next question. Women and binah. Can we apply the idea of women having extra binah to their micromanaging abilities, and if this can also take on a negative form of obsession with details as in why do you do this, do it this way and not that way. And here's how the questioner puts it. Hi, Rabbi Jacobson. I'm having a debate with a friend and would love your input. The topic is women as micromanagers. We get messages every day from society that wives micromanage, control, and nag. It's definitely the stereotype. My thoughts are that these messages are a reflection of the underlying truth that binah yeseda nitna be'isha. A woman was given an additional power of binah and understanding. And binah, when used in a negative way, is the obsession with details, with why did you do it this way and not that way. My friend, on the other hand, thinks that I'm twisting Chassidus to make up my own interpretations, and that women are not more prone to micromanaging, but it's just presented that way in pop culture for whatever reason. Would love to hear your thoughts and any sources you may be able to point me towards. I know this is totally your realm, so I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. My reply is that I agree with your general take on the matter, with the important qualification that not all women are alike. There are those women whose binah gene, so to speak, both in its positive and negative manifestation, is not as prominent, as well as men whose binah may be more pronounced than it is by other men. All humans have chachma, binah, and das, all 10 faculties. A woman has binah yeseda in general. Additionally, binah is not limited to micromanaging. It can also include applied wisdom, fleshed out concepts, intellect that gives birth to results, good thinking, and implementing ideas in a very practical way. So, overall, yes, there is, like anything, has a positive side and negative side. I'm not here to go feed stereotypes, obviously. I'm not commenting on that. But the idea of a woman's strength in this area can, of course, if it's misused, like anything, just like a man's strength can be misused and it turns into something that's not meant to be. So that's my response to this. Okay. Next question. Just moving right along. Friend using me. Is there a limit to showing kindness to another? I have a friend who I feel is using me. Is there such a thing as too much? Is the mitzvah of gemach something that has a share and is considered done when a reasonable amount of time is offered to a friend? Or is the mitzvah really to give all that is necessary? I feel sometimes like I'm being a therapist on call. I'm beginning to resent it. I feel that if I know that this is the right thing to do, I will find new strengths to do it. It's an excellent question and a difficult one to answer in general terms because it's case by case. But let's put it this way. That we have a mitzvah to help other people in every possible way is clear. At the same time, you may not always be helping someone if they're using you and you're becoming resentful. Because there's an element of chayecha kaidmin, there is that you need to do some things. Your life comes first. If you're giving up your life and the life of your family just to help others, and there are people who have done that. People who help strangers more than they help their own children. Not necessarily healthy. You may think it's altruistic. It's so giving, Mesiras Nefesh. But it's Mesiras Nefesh on other people's cheshbon. So this needs a really objective perspective. And the most important thing, using the words of the chapter 6 of Bos Legani, it cannot be your perspective. Because with all your good intentions, you may be have blind spots here. Some people, it looks like compassion, but it's really avoiding an issue. So they just become completely giving, without taking care of what they have to be taken care of. So this needs a balanced approach. And if you do feel resentful, this needs to be asked a question to an objective person. Is your resentment legitimate? I've seen situations, I've been in them myself, where sometimes you think you're helping someone, you realize they're just you're not helping them. They just use you and drain you. And you realize the more you give them, you're actually not helping them. You help them more by saying, At Khan, I'm there for you, but let me know when you do A, B, C. So this comes down to a judgment call in each particular case and having an objective perspective, making sure you're not giving too much or you're not giving too little. Because the same question can be asked, maybe you're not being kind enough, maybe you're not giving enough. That's what I would say. Chassidic language is called chesed and gvura. You need gvura shebe chesed. Even chesed, love, needs breaks. It's like the gas is chesed, gvura. It needs to be tempered, it needs to be seasoned, it needs to be channeled, it needs to be harnessed, it needs to be disciplined. Only gvura needs chesed shebe gvura. It's a combination. Rain falls on the ground, it's called gvura's kshamim. Why? Geshem, rain, is chesed. Gvura's kshamim because it turns it into raindrops. If the rain comes gushing down, it floods the fields and destroys them. If there's no rain at all, it destroys the fields as well. You need the perfect balance where the rain is coming, but it's measured, and it's tailored to the recipient that they can absorb what you're giving. There are a few other questions that we said we'd talk about. Because of time limitations, I believe I'd like to put one off the next week, but I will address Ayin Hora. Is Ayin Hora real or imagined? What was the Rebbe's approach to Ayin Hora? Did he believe in it? What if I feel strongly that I'm being envied, and rightfully so? Should I go to someone who deals with this, or do we say about this as well? Mandalay kopit, meaning one that doesn't care won't affect you. Well, that's exactly right. The Rebbe once had an expression, I don't have the source for it, and I wish I could find it, if anybody knows where it is, in writing or in a fabrengen and so on, that the Rebbe said that an Ayin Hora affects only someone that believes in it. The concept is based on Ein Mazel Yisro, which means the mazolas and all the predictions and all the predispositions that the mazolas may offer. It says when it talks about Avram Avinu, that you are now freeing yourself from being under the control of the constellations and the mazel. We say mazel tov, and we say that every month has its sign and so on. So Chassidus explains that's predisposition. It's a month of mazel. That doesn't mean it controls. Just like Ov is not necessarily controlled to say that you're going to have negative experiences. It's a month where there's cycles in time, so it's like certain predisposition states. But that something controls you, only God controls this world. And when a person allows others, or fears, or someone else's, so to speak, curse, God forbid, or envy, to affect you, you yourself become vulnerable to it. And that's not unheard of, even in medicine. Immunity and lack of immunity is very much about attitudes. When you have a positive attitude, you're going to be less immune to somebody else's attitudes. So basically, Ayin Hora is something we bring upon ourselves, and the Rebbe never went with the approach, go to some psychic, or even according to Torah and Halacha. That's not even acceptable from a Torah point of view. But even Torah and Halacha, not to focus on how do we get rid of an Ayin Hora, but to focus on thinking well, thinking good, trach good, v'zayin good, thinking positively, changing your attitude, changing your approach to things, and that itself has a reaction that in turn brings positivity in our lives. And negative energy, unfortunately, open to receiving negative energy. That's the brief answer. This is a call out to anyone out there, a shout out to anyone. If you do have a source, a letter, a note, a fabrengen, a sikha, anything from the Rebbe or the Rabbeim about this topic, I really would appreciate l'teyelis harabim for the benefit of the public. I would obviously share it. If it's something that you have that's confidential, you don't have to send it to me with a name. But that would really be appreciated, because I've talked about this many times. I've never found a direct, specific source, except here and there alluding to it, where the Rebbe does not allow anything to be focusing on negatives. I did see a letter in the Igris where they wrote about a daughter, the parents writing about a daughter that's suffering from different anxieties, and they think it may be connected to something like a bad omen. And the Rebbe says probably it's connected more to a bad relationship she had or is having. Clearly, not accepting the idea that there's some omen or curse or Ayin Hora, evil eye, and so on. But beyond that, I would definitely appreciate if anybody has more information on this. Okay. The Chassidus question, let us get to the Chassidus question. It's a rather lengthy question, but since the questioner used and invoked this week's Parsha, it seemed like a timely thing to address, so let us read the question. Connected to Parsha B'Shalach, which of course tells us the story of Kriyas Yamsuf, the parting of the sea. Connecting to Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe in chapter 2, in Shar Yichud V'Amunah, the Alter Rebbe uses Kriyas Yamsuf as an example and a kol shken v'kal v'chemer to demonstrate the fact that the existence and the creation is perpetually being renewed every given moment. And here's the questioner writes, Rabbi Jacobson, your classes are amazing, and although I appreciate all the advice and clarity, what I appreciate most is the Chassidus questions. They are really so informative, as it's nice to hear from someone who seemingly has the big picture of Teres Chassidus. In the second chapter of Shari Yuchid V'Amunah, the Alter Rebbe uses the parting of the sea, Kriyas Yamsuf, as an example to understand the ongoing process of creation. I'm going to read part of the Shari Yuchid V'Amunah simply to understand the question. Creation, the Alter Rebbe writes, this is loose English translation of Perek Beis, chapter 2. Creation, the Alter Rebbe writes, is an even greater miracle than, for example, the splitting of the Red Sea. For then God drove back the sea by a strong east wind all the night, and the waters were divided and stood upright as a wall. If God had stopped the wind, the waters would have instantly flowed downward, as is their way in nature. And undoubtedly they would not have stood upright as a wall. Even though this nature of water, to flow downward, is also created ex nihilo. It's a very important point in the question here. Again, this nature itself is also created ex nihilo, in addition to the water. For a stone wall stands erect by itself without the assistance of the wind. But the nature of water is not so. Thus, if for the miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea, the continuous action of God was necessary, the wind that kept the water upward like a wall, how much more so it is in the creation of something out of nothing, which transcends nature and is far more miraculous than the splitting of the Red Sea, that with the withdrawal of the power of the Creator from the thing created, God forbid, it would revert to naught and complete non-existence. Rather, the activating force of the Creator must continuously be in the thing created to give it life and existence. So now back to the questioner. The Rebbe explains this comparison at length, saying that the parting sea was essentially not a new creation ex nihilo, but a change of yesh miyesh. He's referring to the Rebbe's explanation on this piece in Tanya in several places, which I'll refer to soon. That the Rebbe is saying that the parting sea is not a new creation, it's yesh miyesh, meaning one state, one existent state. The fluidity of water was merely replaced by another existent state, its ability to remain upright. Nevertheless, since the ability of water to stand rock-like is something novel, the force that is responsible for this novelty, even though this novelty involves no more than a progression from one yesh to another, must constantly cause it to come about. Surely then the Alter Rebbe concludes with regard to the creation of the world, which comes into being absolutely in ex nihilo, the activating force of the Creator must continuously be present in the created universe, providing it with life and existence. The writer continues, and I'm reading this even though I'm not comfortable reading the next line, but I'm reading it intentionally because I don't want to censor it, and then I'll comment afterwards. So I apologize if this offends anyone. I don't know if we're allowed to disagree with the Rebbe's interpretation on Tanya, but in my limited understanding, the writer writes, this is very hard to grasp. How can creation from nothing, yesh ma'ayin, after all, be derived as a kol shken v'kal v'chemer from a change of one state to another, yesh miyesh? It doesn't seem like a good example, because they're completely two different realities. One is changing simply the water from resting, from flowing downward, standing upright, and here it's a creation from nothing into something. On the contrary, if parting the sea was a change from yesh to yesh, from one state to another, then it shouldn't have needed a strong east wind all the night. It should have just remained in its changed form. And it wasn't a change in the first place, rather more like a tree bending in the wind. Then it has nothing to do with this whole concept of the chapter. I hope I was clear. Maybe you can help your listeners with a clear understanding of the Alter Rebbe's intention. It seems interesting that something so fundamental in the puzzle of the second section of Tanya should be so vague. I would humbly suggest that the Alter Rebbe meant that Kriyas Yamsuf was a change ma'ayin liyesh, because the new mentality of the water was not a changed version of the old one, rather a new nature, so to speak, and then the Kal V'chemer makes more sense. And even though some of the wording isn't so on target, it can be explained, although I won't go into it here. What does remain somewhat unclear, regardless of the actual interpretation of the above, is that according to the Alter Rebbe, why did Moshe have to do something to have the waters return to their original state, when all Hashem had to do was stop the wind? And while I'm at it, let me add one more question. According to the whole idea in Tanya, the entire creation is constantly being sustained by God's word. So why is the parting sea unique? That it required a wind to part the waters. Why couldn't the word of Hashem commanding the sea to split be enough to do the job? Why all of a sudden was a wind needed? If a wind is needed to keep the world spinning, is a wind needed to keep the world spinning? The Dvar Hashem seems to do a great job with everything else. Please elaborate. Okay, I know it's a long question. I hope everybody followed, but it's an interesting question, and I will immediately take offense to that statement of the Rebbe, whether we have allowed to disagree with the Rebbe. You're allowed to do whatever you want, but I would just forget now the issue that he's the Rebbe. Simply on a seichel level, You can imagine a person who's dedicated his entire life to understanding and learning Chassidus requires a little more respect that maybe you don't understand what he's saying. So you may have your thoughts, that's very fine, but I cannot just go ahead and speak without. And now when I looked into the subject matter, it became very clear that the writer actually did not study the Rebbe's answer, at least not in the proper fashion. And when you look at the Rebbe's approach, you'll see how it makes Tanya come alive, actually. And without it, you can't really understand this whole piece in Tanya. So briefly, because time is limited, let me say the following. When you learn the Tanya, the bigger question that you can ask is, what do you need Kriyas Yamsuf example altogether? Just say that God created the world every second. The world doesn't have any value of its own without the Creator. Think of it like breathing. If you don't breathe, the breath won't come out. So you need to have a constant force to create. And the Alter Rebbe goes in chapter 2 and says, not like those that make the mistake that creation is like yesh mi-yesh. And he gives the example of a jeweler, a craftsman, who takes an object, let's say a raw piece of gold, and turns it into a ornament, into a ring, and then he goes off. That ring doesn't require his constant renewal. Why? Because he didn't do anything. In reality, he only shaped mishanet suda. He changed the shape of the gold into another shape. Had he created the ring, which is not possible, we're incapable, that's one thing. But all he did was he took the gold and shaped it into something else, so it doesn't require an ongoing, renewed energy. Whereas creation, existence is something that did not exist in any shape and form before. So therefore, it requires a constant renewal every moment. What's missing? Why does the Alter Rebbe have to bring Kriyas Yamsuf? And the answer is, when you start studying the Rebbe's answer, and let me give you the sources for it, in a number of places. Likutei Sichos number 1, chapter 6. Likutei Sichos chapter 6, page 90. Likutei Sichos chapter, I'm saying volume 6, page 90. And volume 7, page 189. And Igros Kodesh, the Rebbe's letters, volume 10, page Kuf Nun Zayin, page 157. These are some of the places that the Rebbe talks about it. And all with a consistency. And each place adds something to the other. Here again, I wish I could elaborate more, but I'll try to just sum up the point. And I'm putting it in my own words. The Rebbe does not ask this question about Kriyas Yamsuf, but when you see the Rebbe's answer, you understand the whole point. What's going on here is the following. The Alter Rebbe wants to make, the whole point of Shayach Zamunah, Tanya in general, is to make it palatable for us to relate to the divine. We live in a world, it's not just coming to tell us about perpetual creation, it's to teach us that existence is completely illogical to worship this yesh of this world because it doesn't have anything of its own. It's completely dependent on the ayin, on the dvar Hashem, le'elam Hashem dvar chenisu b'shamayim, and not just once, but forever. Every moment we are dependent on that relationship. That in turn creates a relationship between us and God, and the need for having that relationship, because we have no value without it. But to make it palatable and to negate what others may think that it's just a change of shape, the Alter Rebbe wants to bring examples. Kriyas Yamsuf is an example that gives us something in between. It's not quite reshaping a piece of gold, because there you don't need anything, because the gold, God created in a way that you could shape gold in many different ways. So when a human being goes and a craftsman goes and shapes a piece of material into another piece of material, even if it's a beautiful thing and very valuable, that doesn't require the craftsman's constant contribution, constant renewal. Kriyas Yamsuf is an interesting phenomenon. Why? Because on one hand, God created water. And He created water with a certain nature. What's the nature of water? That it falls. It's not like a wall that stands. Water falls. That's its nature. So now the question is, since God's creating the world every moment, so of course He could just change the engineering and the code, the program, and the water would stand. But He wants existence to be as it is. God does not want to break nature. So here you have in nature something that was like above nature. It's similar to what we learn about Chassidus talks about Nisim. There are miracles that are open miracles. There's nature. And there's Nisim that are concealed within nature, like Purim. It helps us understand the bridge, the interface between the divine and existence. Creation itself is a complete pella. We have nothing in existence that gives us an example. Kriyas Yamsuf gives us a small taste of an interesting reality. What is the reality? That the water is falling, and then the Eibishter wanted it should split so the Jews could be able to walk through it. What did he do? He could have done nothing. He could have said, I want it to split. No, he sent a wind, a strong wind. What does he need a wind? He needs a wind. But he wants to demonstrate that even in the world of a yesh, you could have sometimes an element that in nature you see something that's a miraculous element without completely destroying the nature. So the Rebbe says that that's why the Alter Rebbe adds. This is also yesh ma'ayin. Because water, because you see a wall, for example, could stand. The fact that water is falling is itself an additional element. The Rebbe uses the word teva rishon and teva sheni. Teva rishon, that's in the Igris, is the nature is that water should exist. Then God superimposed another element and said, this type of yesh ma'ayin, I'm creating another yesh ma'ayin. And what's that second yesh ma'ayin? Is that water falls. What happened by Kriyas Yamsuf? He only suspended Teva Sheni, not Teva Rishon. He didn't stop the water from being water. He wants it to be water. He wants it to have the nature of falling, but he put a wind that creates that nullifies, so to speak, the second nature of water that did not have to fall. That's also yesh ma'ayin. And since you need to even change the tzura of the water, which is not like changing the gold. This is already a changing a tzura which requires a wind all night. And even there you need all the time, even though it's only changing one nature to another nature, you need the constant renewal. So how much more so when you're creating something completely new? Yesh ma'ayin mamish, that for sure you need something. That's the Rebbe's logic. Now, interestingly, the writer is saying that, the yesh ma'ayin should be seen as the lifting the water into standing like a wall. As a matter of fact, Rabbi Hillel Paritcher, in Parsha Vayera, in Pelacharim, and Parsha Vayera, I'll give you the daf, page Nun Beis Beis, 52.2, actually interprets it that way. And the Rebbe brings that also in the shlichus, that he interprets that Teva Zez, that's Yesh Ma'ayin, is referring not to the falling water, but to the water standing. And the way he interprets it is that even though it's also Yesh Ma'ayin, that the Eibishter made it that way, however, it's not a real chiddush, because we see that a wall could stand. So the fact that something stands is not such a tremendous chiddush. We have items in this existence that stand. That's why it's a kol shkem v'kal v'chemer, because even though it's not a full chiddush, nevertheless, it still needed a wind all night. That's so much more so when it comes to creation, something from nothing. Now the Rebbe the Rebbe says in one place, Pashtas, the simple explanation is that the teva goes on the water falling, not on the water standing. But at the end of the day, in one place the Rebbe writes that it's be'efen acher ktsas. Rabbi Hillel's interpretation is similar, is different somewhat. Another place he says be'efen acher. Now you could say, because Rabbi Hillel's interpretation doesn't really change the havana, the understanding. It just changes that word. And it could be, because in some way the words may fit a little more to Rabbi Hillel's interpretation on one end, but it doesn't fit well really with the next line with the wall, which fits much more according to the Rebbe's interpretation. What you have at the end here is you have an example of something that happened in history. And obviously, this is an example not for those that don't believe. Because if they don't believe in Kriyas Yamsuf either. The people who think that the world is like yesh miyesh. But for us that do believe, we have an experience where you have something in between. It's still a yesh miyesh on one hand, and there's an element of yesh ma'ayin, but it's not inherent to water that has to fall. That needed a second creation. And to suspend that second Teva Sheni, God needed to keep the wind blowing all the time. How much more so with creation itself, which is constantly Yesh Ma'ayin, complete Yesh Ma'ayin. So you understand also why Kriyas Yamsuf is being used. It's making it a little easier to understand. The example would be that if you wanted to hold up water from falling, you'd need something constantly holding it up. Now, of course, God could have suspended nature, but as I explained, He didn't want to suspend nature. That's not the point. He wanted it to be within the existence. That's why it says, kosher k'kriyas yamsuf. Why is it kosher? Chassidus asks. God can do anything. Because in the laws of nature, to do that is kosher. Creation is in the first place not nature, as he says in this perek here. The whole thing is, there's no choice there. There has to be beyond nature. Because the thing is not possible in nature to create something out of something that is completely, has nothing comparable. But a Kriyas Yamsuf is in nature, and in nature to do that, there's an element of kosher to it. The fact that afterwards, when the wind stopped, it would fall down, he says. So the Rebbe already bavarns this in Likkutei Sichos Chelik Vav. He explains why does the Alter Rebbe have to bring about the wind? It could have just been, at the end of the day, when it stopped, the waters fell back. That you have to look into the volume 6 that I mentioned before. Now, I elaborated a little more than I wanted to, but I think it was necessary. I just want to add one more thing to the Chassidus of last week, Chassidus Applied. So someone wrote a question which I want to address, and that is about thank you for the clarity you offer on a great number of topics, including the study of Chassidus. It is appreciated greatly. Last week you started a Chassidus question about the makeup of a chair using the letters kisei, and didn't give a clear answer, in my opinion. You went between saying that everything with a Hebrew name, including people and parshas, is telling of the essence of the thing named, but then quoted a mimer, or the Rebbe Rayatz actually quoted Teira in Chanukah, where you derive that only the original context is the makeup. What I said there was that the matter, the body, the chaymer, it needs is defined by the name that constantly creates. I didn't think the comparison was good at all in the first place, but studying this year's chapter of Basel Ligani along with the Rebbe's mimer of Tavshin Tezayin, it seems clear that even when something is transformed by a human being, it gets a new name and makeup. The Rebbe is discussing the Kroshim, which were originally Atzei Shittim, and were transformed by humans and take up a new element of letters as explained in the mimer. Please clarify if I'm correct. Thank you. Let me, being that the question is asked, let me just say this. What I said last week, and I'll elaborate again, that it's apparent from the different sources I gave then, that there's two things about a name, a Hebrew name. One is that it's not a Shem Heskami, it's a Shem Etzem, as the Rebbe Taka explains in Tavshin Tazayim Basel Ligani, on this chapter 6 that we learned this year. What does that mean? That the name captures the essence of what the object is. And also, as he says in Shayachet Vamuna, vivifies it in a constant way. It gives it life, because it's like the soul of the object. Then there's a second thing called perpetual renewal. That it constantly needs that type of chidush, chachus b'chol rega v'rega. Both about the chemer of an object, the pure matter, both are there. There's a name for it. Let's say rakia, oir, even evan, zov, kesef, etc., gold, silver. There's a name. So there, both the name gives out the soul, but it also has a perpetual, constant. Gold will always be renewed by the letters that renew the word zov, as silver is by the word kesef, and so on. But about the surah, about the shape of something, when you shape gold or silver into another object, do you say that this object now takes over and that's what gives it life? And no more, it's still made out of gold. So let's take the example of a kisei. You take wood, which is eitz, that's what vivified the wood. That's what energizes the wood on a constant, perpetual way, that's clear. You make a chair out of it, and let's say you break the chair and then make a table out of it, and then you take that and turn it into a bookcase. They all have different names in Hebrew. So the names describe taka the kisei. The word kisei describes the soul of what the kisei is. But to say that now it's being perpetually created by the letters chaf, samach, aleph, instead of the words ayin, sadik, eitz, not necessarily. Because that's yesh mi yesh. It's the yesh ma'ayin element, which is the chemer, that is constantly being renewed. Now, when it talks about things that Torah changes the name, like here, atzei shittim becomes kroshim, so Torah knows that the purpose of the atzei shittim of this wood was in order to be a beam in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Mishkan. That's why the Rebbe makes such a thing. Explains why is he explaining it? Because you need to understand the kuf, reish, and the shin. You could say 1 second, it's called atzei shittim. It's not called kroshim, but the Torah says so, and that's why the Rebbe brings the Magid. The Magid brings the story with Adam Arishan giving names, and then also about parents giving names. Both of them are divinely endowed, both Adam in his case and parents, with knowing, even if they don't know it right now, they have a certain Ruach HaKodesh to know what this human being, what name is fitting based on what will happen with him in his life. But to say that when you take a chair and turn it into a table, or table back into a chair, or whatever it is, not necessarily it has that same type of element. So I think it's important to distinguish, and I'd love to hear more comments if people have what to say about this, because obviously there needs to be a distinction between the different levels of chidush, as I just mentioned. I should add, there's also a concept in Chassidus called chidush hayeshenus, that even chidush yesh ma'ayin, when we are recreated every moment anew, we're not recreated like we were just born. You're created, if you're 20 years old, you're recreated like you're a 20-year-old. If a tree is 100 years old, it's recreated like it's a 100-year-old tree. So even in Chidush, Mamish Yesh Mayin, there's also reckoning with the reality of what it was a moment before. It's created in the form that it was a moment before. So you could say there's a fundamental difference for the first time something is created. Then it's Mamish Yesh Mayin because it didn't exist. The tree was never here before, which is the beginning of creation, and then the recreation that happens every given moment. The bottom line, all this leads us to understand our relationship with Elikus, because what's the nafkamina of all this? It's that we have a relationship, an ongoing relationship, and sometimes it's on our terms. That's the things, yesh miyesh, where we relate to more, and sometimes it's on divine terms by recognizing that there's a power that's renewing itself every given moment. So both are necessary because we want not just that yesh mayin, that we are completely dependent on God, obviously, but we want that dependency also to become integrated and internalized in our understanding of existence, which is a yesh miyesh type of existence. So that's why the renewal happens, like with Kriyas Yamsov I mentioned, on the terms of nature, because we want the divine to be manifest in Dira B'Tachtenim, and not in a way that Meshadad, that breaks the existence, but on the contrary, teaches existence and acclimates it to understand the forces that keep it alive, the divine forces for us to align our lives with what God wants of us. This has gone longer than expected, but hopefully for good reason. So let me go quickly to the 3 essays. And the 3 essays that we've been doing. First essay is making your time valuable. This is a Hebrew essay and talks about time and how busy we are these days, and essentially showing how Chassidus teaches us not to cut off from the world around us, but how to recognize that in every moment, in everything you do, you can elevate it to Elikus, to the divine. And how relevant this is today because of so much inundating us and distracting us in our time. So instead of just cutting off, to actually show and use it all for Avodas Hashem. That's the gist of it. I'm being brief because of time, and obviously it's a little more elaborate. You can see all these essays at meaningfullife.com/essays or meaningfullife.com/MyLife /essays. And this is he brings it based on Tanya chapter 19, 41, Likutei Sichos, volume test, page 133. That's one essay. The next essay, also in Hebrew, the first essay, I should mention the name, by Nochem Rabinovich, age 33, Shliach Temchet Mimim, Kfar Chabad, Israel. Second essay I'm reading here is Coping with Anxiety by Yisrael Assaline, age 25, Kiryat Gat, Israel. And this is about dealing with, of course, anxiety and the Chassidus approach to it. And he primarily bases this on the famous letter of the Tzemach Tzedek, which he talks about fear. Brings the story I've mentioned a number of times, story about the Alter Rebbe, Mamish, the night of the Alter Rebbe's Istalkus, how he told him your attitude is what brings down, will affect Shemaim, but the word from the Magidal, the Mus Mare Odom, that your attitude, a negative attitude, because the Alter Rebbe heard that Tzemach Tzedek davening with a certain sadness because he saw that Alter Rebbe was waning, the Gashmias, so the Alter Rebbe told him that's not the way to be. So he uses that letter as a basis of how one deals, how one changes your mindset. And the key is changing your attitude is the key to conquering fear and anxiety. That's essay number 2. And essay number 3, Beyond Empathy, by Yitzchak Hoffman, age 30, Rabbi at Mayanot, Beitar Ilit, Yerushalayim. That's the third essay. And that essay is Beyond Empathy. We're a very well-written essay, a very powerful essay about relationships and what empathy is all about. And he goes into the whole idea of what Chassidus teaches. Uses the 3 reasons for creation in Chelik Vov, Shmei's famous Shmei Sicha, to explain it in context of our relationships. That we have a 3-step process. One is respect, empathy, and acceptance, based on the number 1 reason that God wanted to actualize Himself, L'gal Shleimus Kechesov. The second reason, God wanted us to recognize His truth. So that's the second type of relationship. And the third, ultimate motivation is acceptance, where God's yearning for us to accept Him into our lives. And he talks about this in the context of personal, first of all, cognitively in our minds, and then in application, goes through a whole cognitive exercises and then practical behavioral exercises in real detail of what you can do to have that type of deeper relationship based on those reasons. I would say this essay would have been a top essay had it been more fleshed out and a little more tied together a lot of the strings. But the basis of it is very interesting, and that's the third essay for this week. And with this, I want to bid everyone a very freilichen and meaningful Yud Shvat, a day when we reconnect, listening to the Maimer Bas Lagani Tov Shin Yud Aleph is a tremendous step, especially when you hear the last words, the last few minutes when the Rebbe cries and talks about, you can see the Rebbe going over from being a private citizen, if you can say that, to a Rebbe. Responsibility, understanding the commitment, the responsibility of this Deir Hashvi, gives us our mission, makes it clear in that Fabrengen that we have to do Aveda B'Kei Chatzmei, Mizal Zich Nicht Einreden, Fegelich in Buzim, as the Rebbe said. We should not deceive ourselves into thinking that the Rebbe will just do the job for us. He sets the tone that we must do something. So may we use this Yud Shvat in a way that we really shake up the status quo and actually really shift things. Changes breed changes. We want changes. We want the Gula Mitzvah Vashlema, as the Rebbe says, the end of the Maimer, to be Niskim, Zenzich Mit Rebem Dolamatam Asarat Tvachim V'hu Yigalenu. So until next week, everyone have a very meaningful Yud Shvat. Every Sunday, 8 to 9, MyLife, Chassidus Applied.